Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shakespeare and Company. Migration has dominated the news agenda in recent years. Yet while thousands of column inches have been dedicated to describing encampments in Calais and Greece, to cataloguing shipwrecks and rescue operations in the Mediterranean, to detailing the economic and social impact on destination countries, and to hand-wringing over the political hay made out of the situation across the ideological spectrum, vanishingly little has been told of the migrant stories themselves. The experiences of migrants, as Daniel Trilling writes, are often treated as secondary to the question of what to do with them. In Lights in the Distance, Exile and Refuge at the Borders of Europe, Daniel Trilling takes steps to redress this imbalance by giving the floor to an ensemble of migrant voices from different countries and with different reasons for seeking refuge in Europe. As we come to know Jamal and Zainab and Usman and Caesar and Fatima and Hakima and Farhan and the Ahmeds in their own words, we learn of the violence, terror and societal collapse that forced them from their homes, of the perilous journeys to Europe and their absorption into the Kafkaesque quagmire of the asylum system, a system that is being increasingly fine-tuned to provide as unwelcoming as an arrival in Europe as possible. Not only does Lights in the Distance act as a compelling and compassionate testimony to the inherent complexity of this era of mass migration, but it also stands as a reminder, not that one should ever have been needed, of our common humanity. Daniel Trilling is the editor of the New Humanist magazine and has reported extensively on refugees in Europe. His work has been published in the London Review of Books, Guardian, New York Times and others, and won a 2017 Migration Media Award. His first book, Bloody Nasty People, The Rise of Britain's Far Right, was longlisted for the 2013 Orwell Prize. The Observer described Lights in the Distance as brilliantly researched and written, and Olivia Lang called it humane and illuminating, adding, Lights in the Distance is a vital examination of what the new era of border control and deportations really means, what it costs and who pays the price. While the New Statesman declared, if knowledge is the foundation of action, then Trilling has done us a great service by turning masses and numbers into people whom we like, who we can see are like us. Please join me in welcoming Daniel Trilling to Shakespeare and Company. So I think we're going to begin tonight with a short reading from Lights in the Distance that'll give us a sense of how the book is.
Yeah, absolutely. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes. Good, thank you. So just a little bit of context before I jump into the reading. I started the research for this book in 2012, and initially I think my idea was to sketch out to map out the border system that had grown up at the edges of the European Union, and at that time I was very focused on the systemic aspect of it, so how borders are not just physical defences at the edges of a territory, but also legal and political systems for filtering people that stretch right into the heart of our capital cities and also way beyond, the borders of France or the borders of the EU. But quite early on into the research, I decided it was much more important to keep following the people that I met in my initial bits of research, find out what happened to them, because their journeys didn't end as soon as they'd reached Europe. There was a lot more to tell, and also I just felt I didn't really understand what was happening from their point of view, and I wanted to explore that a lot further. So the way the book has ended up is it's trying to tell those stories, and it's the stories of 9 or 10 different people who I met in the course of my research, and then I combine that at the end with reflection on the story of my own grandmother, who was a refugee twice in her life, first from Kiev in 1920 and then from Berlin to London in 1939. But I'm just going to read you a short bit now from the end of my story about a young man called Jamal, who I originally met in Calais in 2014, and he's somebody who had been in Europe for 5 years before that point without having found a place to settle. Jamal had almost reached the end of his story as we sat beside the river in the town he now called home. It was nearly evening, and he invited me back to his apartment one more time to make dinner. In the kitchen we made a potato stew with onions, paprika and rice. We used to eat this in Calais, he said. If we found meat, then we'd put meat in it too. Rihanna songs played from his phone as we chopped the vegetables. A lot of his Sudanese friends had got into R&B and hip-hop since they'd arrived in Europe, Jamal said. He laughed as he told me a story about a friend who was now in the UK. When he texts me, he's always like, yo, 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 why can't he just say hello or hi? I asked Jamal again about the sequence of events that had brought him from Calais to this northern European country. He didn't want to go into detail. He didn't yet feel secure enough in his new home, but I suggested that he could tell me just enough so that my readers would understand the dysfunction in Europe's asylum system, to give them a sense of the gulf between the way states try to regulate movement and the messy reality of life. He agreed to try. After a friend of mine crossed from Calais to England, Jamal said, I started to become calm in my mind, and I said, let me try something while I'm taking a break from trying to hide under the lorries. At a squatted townhouse in Calais, he had made friends with an Eritrean man. We would meet at the squat. Every time I went there to charge my phone, I would speak to him. Jamal didn't want the other Sudanese to know he was meeting up with an Eritrean because, he said, if I get caught talking to him, people will say I'm causing problems again. The rule Jamal was so proud of, don't tell anybody what you're doing until you do it, was in play. As he had done in Greece a few years previously, Jamal used his new friendship to educate himself, learning the names of other places in Europe where a young man like him might get a better deal. After being rejected by many of the other Sudanese migrants in Calais, Jamal wasn't as keen as he used to be to join the diaspora in the UK. Perhaps he would fare better elsewhere. Based on what his new Eritrean friend had told him, he chose another country. Jamal left Calais and went back to La Chapelle in Paris. He was taken aback to see how many more people there were sleeping rough under the railway track. This was in the middle of 2014, by the way. In February, there were only 30 of us. Now, it was around 100 people. He spent 3 days in La Chapelle, mainly in internet cafes, researching his new destination, while he waited for his sister to wire him some money. On the third day in La Chapelle, Jamal phoned a contact who said he could arrange transport for a few €100. He made a playlist for the journey on his phone. Sean Paul, Jennifer Lopez, Rihanna, and a lot of English rappers since I was going away from England. At La Chapelle, the Sudanese contact met him and took him to a Paris train station. There, he was shown to a waiting car. One man sat in the driver's seat. 2 men who spoke Syrian Arabic sat in the back. The driver wasn't Sudanese, Jamal said. He wasn't French either, but I don't know where he was from because he didn't speak to me at all during the journey. When the driver stopped for a break, he would write out a note in English on the dashboard, telling the passengers how long they could get out of the car for. After some time, the car stopped and the 2 Syrian men got out. Then Jamal and his driver continued, still without speaking. Jamal had his playlist. I kept listening to Loki's Dear England. Do you know that song? I didn't, so I asked him to play it to me. He paused Rihanna midway through American Oxygen and switched to Dear England. It was a melancholy track with lyrics about police brutality, about military intervention overseas, and treasures looted from the Empire and displayed in the British Museum. When Jamal reached his destination, he wandered around until he found some police officers who could tell him where the nearest asylum reception centre was. I got there, they took all my details, my date of birth, my nationality. I stayed there 3 or 4 days, then they sent me to a camp. At the reception centre, he applied for asylum. He was interviewed. His interviewers asked him questions about his home country, his reasons for leaving, why he hadn't stayed put elsewhere. He answered their questions, hoping that they would satisfy criteria his interviewers did not let him see. They called him in for a second interview and asked him all the same questions again. He answered them again. Then, Jamal received a letter saying his application had been accepted. The last time I had a passport was when I was in Sudan, he said, and that was a false passport so I could get out. That was the first passport I ever got. Now I'll have a real one. My passport here will be my first real one. I will not be afraid of everything in my head. I hardly knew Jamal, and yet he'd told me his story in such detail. His whole adult life up to this point had been shaped by systems for protection, for deciding who deserves which resources and where, that weren't working as they should. Instead, he'd had to build small networks of friends or acquaintances with whom he shared temporary goals and use those to survive. Why, then, did he trust me, and why did I trust him back? While we were waiting for the stew to finish cooking, Jamal described how, in the evenings, at the Sudanese camp behind the supermarket in Calais, men would sit around the fire and try to burn off their fingerprints. they were mutilating themselves to avoid detection by the European police database so that they can make an asylum claim in France while trying to reach the UK at the same time. You put one end of a metal pole in the fire, Jamal said, and wait for it to go red hot. Then you take it out and run your fingertips along the glowing end, one by one, for an hour or two, until they're too blistered to be recognised by a scanning machine. Like this, he said, grabbing my hand and pressing it into the handle of the fridge door. He pushed my index finger into the metal and ran it downwards firmly 2 or 3 times.
Thank you. I think it was a really a good selection, a really representative selection of the book as a whole, actually, because one of the things that struck me when I was reading Lights in the Distance was the texture to the stories, the texture and the complexity and the detail. And I think it struck me because generally when refugee stories or migrant stories are presented, suddenly I had a sense that a lot of that is taken off. I mean, it suddenly made a lot of even the most well-meaning journalism about the migrant situation seem very flat and very one-dimensional. And I was just wondering, was that something that you were determined to do when you realised the form this book was going to take, was to try and preserve that texture and that complexity?
I mean, it wasn't... Yeah, kind of. It took me quite a while to work out how to write it and what level of detail to include and how to position myself in relation to what I'm describing. I think from early on I had this idea that I feel like I've got quite a close emotional connection to this subject, just because I grew up in the same house with my grandmother. I grew up with her telling me and my brother stories about her escape and her experiences trying to settle other places. And so, you know, for years when this kind of topic came up in the news, sort of people probably have this about other things they've got personal connections to, but it was sort of something in my head a bit, oh yeah, that's the thing I know about or the thing I want to know more about. But at the same time, when I started to try and concentrate on this as a journalist, I thought it's weird because I find a lot of the way it's written about very affected, you know, it sort of leaves me cold a lot of the time. And I think, I mean, that's not to do down the work of, there's a large amount of really excellent work on refugees and migration coming from all sorts of angles, you know, really important investigative work and political work and the rest of it. But there's maybe a certain kind of storytelling which I term humanitarian storytelling, which takes the logic of kind of NGO aid agency campaigning, where and for good reasons in certain contexts, you start with the extreme experience or the extreme disadvantage and hold that up. And that kind of overshadows everything else. Often, you know, the kind of crudest example of which is those, I don't know if you have them here in Paris, but adverts on transport in London that have a picture of a child and say donate £1 via text. And they even go to the trouble of saying the person's name, but you sort of think that's not really their name, is it? I mean, it's kind of comes across as very unconvincing. But I guess the logic is that you've only got a fleeting moment of attention. You've got to get in there with the sort of hardest detail and get people to act. Well, that can mobilise people in ways that are productive, but I think it also shuts out so much about the situation and the people's lives at the centre of it that I think is really important to try and convey. Not least because, personally, I find if all you know about someone is the incredibly traumatic experience they had, the assumption, I think, is that brings you closer to somebody. I think actually it creates a distance, especially if it's something that you yourself haven't got anything in your life to compare with. And that's why in an earlier version of the book I tried to tell it in the third person, and it just wasn't working, because I thought actually the really interesting thing is how I got to know people, not because it tells you anything about me particularly, but just it's people in context, I think. And
I think also that sort of focus that we can have sometimes on the most extreme details of somebody's story can perhaps be counterproductive, because, for example, you were reading about Jamal listening to music and having a mobile phone. I think sometimes when people are confronted with that complexity of sort of, you can have lost everything and you can be a refugee, but you will still, the mobile phone is, of course, a vital tool, probably one of the most vital for migrants. But I think people say, well, how can he have lost everything but still have a mobile phone. So I think that presentation of extremes can be quite productive.
Yeah. So I mean, on the political level, that's a really important thing, that I think a lot of the hostility and misunderstanding arises from people not having been given the full story. So, the kind of traditional distinction that is made in a lot of discourse around this subject between kind of deserving and undeserving migrants, which you get, that's part of a wider thing about deserving and undeserving poor that you see across lots of different contexts. But it leads to people saying, well, these refugees, people fleeing the war in Syria, they're fleeing a war, they're refugees, but what about these other people? We don't know why they're here. They must be economic migrants, therefore that's bad. They should be discounted, their experiences should be ignored, or they should be treated like a threat. And I think one of the things that I realised from trying to follow people's stories in this way is that although this subject from the top down is governed by these very definite sounding terms and categories, and people are always being forced into one or another, that actually doesn't really play out in people's experiences. So just to take, for example, this distinction between refugee and economic migrant, well, people who have fled a war in one part of the world and are trying to reach Europe actually are both at different points in their journey, because you're trying to find safety, you're also trying to find a place that you can build a life. The things are not neatly separable, and I think the more rigidly we try and impose distinctions on people get crushed underneath the weight of that. And then the second reason for trying to tell all of that detail, it's not so much a kind of, you'll see that they listen to Rihanna and you'll realise they're just like you and you'll feel sympathy for them. It's that of course it's going to be like that. They're people, and their lives, they might have something that seems very important to us going on in their lives, but also they've got all of the rest of the noise that we all have as well. And that's how, they're trying to make decisions in that kind of environment. They're not only driven by sort of needs, but desires and likes and dislikes, and feeling, pissed off some of the time and happy the rest of the time, and various other emotions. And it's more to sort of show, well, that's what it's like. If you were in that situation, that's what it would be like. You'd still have 100 different things going on in your head and trying to make decisions about all of them.
You mentioned, and of course you write about your grandmother's experience. I think essentially all of the people you meet in writing this book, their journey of migration has either only recently finished or is not over yet. They're still trying to get somewhere, and they're still trying to get settled. And at the moment, I think it's when you're writing about Zainab, you say that the story changes after a few years when people have had time to reflect upon it and to make some kind of sense of it. And I'm just wondering, was there an important difference, for example, in the way that your grandmother would talk about her experiences from decades before compared to the migrants you were meeting now, who were still very much in that process and confronted with the day-to-day trials of it? I
mean, I suppose the big difference that it was 50 or 70 years after the event, she was obviously somewhere very safe, had a life, and had been able to access asylum and then citizenship in the UK and kind of the rights that other UK citizens have. So the stories were being presented to me and my brother as a kid as things in the past with a resolution. Also probably because we were children, a bit, with the rougher edges smoothed over, or not entirely actually. She was pretty open about things that had happened to her. So maybe that's a bit different, particularly for people who are still, there's several people in the book who are clearly still just trying to come to terms with what has happened to them in, the previous months when I meet them. But what was similar actually, and the reason why I think a lot of books that try and zoom in and do this kind of detail will focus on like one person or one family, or maybe sort of a couple at most. And actually I went for a larger number of people, because the thing that struck me across all of those stories, and which reminded me of what I'd heard growing up, was just the kind of repetition actually. Sort of, it's these kind of little stories of threat and escape and trying to make your way out however you can at a certain point and making do with what you've got. The sort of the process of hiding your identity or hiding bits of it and revealing it and having to use that as a kind of currency just runs across all of them. So, I mean, to take my grandmother as an example, she was 8 years old or so, when she had to flee Kiev with her parents in the middle of the Russian Civil War, and her mother only got out of the country because they had her father had procured false documents and sent them back to Kiev, and they were travelling on them, but they got stopped at the border. And she had to, my grandmother, as a child, had to hide these false documents in her shoe, and if they'd been found, they would have been shot on the spot. You see that kind of using false identity, hiding it from the authorities again and again, but also it sort of works on a kind of cultural level as well. So you mentioned Zainab, who's a woman originally from Iraq, who who also passed through Calais around the same time as Jamal, and she ended up, she had quite a lot of money when she began her journey, but ended up stuck in Calais, essentially the victim of extortion from a gang of smugglers. And she is Sunni Arab, and the smugglers were Iraqi Kurdish, and there's, for historical reasons, not least Saddam Hussein's oppression of the Kurds in Iraq, there's sometimes hostility between Kurds and Arabs, and because she had grown up in a very multicultural region of Iraq and was fluent in Kurdish, she had to pretend to be Kurdish the whole time she was in that camp to protect her identity, to get through it and get to the other side. There were some references to that in that excerpt of Jamal's story that I just read. He had this conflict with other Sudanese migrants and refugees in Calais, because most Sudanese refugees who come to Europe are from the Darfur region, and they have been persecuted by their own government, which has been using militias largely made up of Sudanese from another ethnic group. In that context, they're known as Africans and Arabs, although obviously they are also both Africans, both groups. And Jamal is from Khartoum, and so the Darfuri refugees, sort of, partly because actually he'd had so much more experience in Europe and knew how to get things done, knew how to look in bins in Calais for food, knew how to find second-hand clothes. They started to resent him, and then started to say, well, maybe you're not even Sudanese, we think you're pretending to be, we don't like you, you don't fit in. And eventually actually he turned that into a strength. He said, well, maybe I don't fit in here, I'll go somewhere else, and he's ended up elsewhere in Northern Europe. But that, I think, particularly when you're sort of forced onto the margins of migration, when you're having to use clandestine routes or rely on smugglers, all of that stuff just becomes, it's life and death in a lot of occasions. And that was really similar to what I sort of learned growing up as well, I think.
One of the other things I think we get from the sort of the rawness of the stories is the sense of, and I think you use this word, the sort of the contingency of these stories, and of the nature of survival generally. There are moments where you fall out of contact with some of the people you've met, or there's a possibility that they're going to be sent back to various different countries, and it really brought it home to me that, in fact, generally the stories we get of migration and refugees, they are the stories of survivors, like people who have reached the end of a route and are able to look back and make sense of it. And in reading these stories of people, most of whom are still en route, we suddenly get filled with a sense of the fragility of their situation, and that these stories might sort of meet an abrupt end. They might not have the kind of the reassuring arc that...
Yeah, or they just might sort of peter out inconclusively, which, a lot of the sort of dramas in our lives tend to do, I think. Like I was describing with Zainab, you can, these are journeys in which situations can change rapidly in a very short space of time. But at other times, essentially, the refugee crisis of 2015 was a major world historical event. And I'm sure everybody likes to play that kind of daydreaming game where you think about things in the past and think about what you would have done in them.
Sure.
The reality is, most of the time, for most people, you're a participant, but you're actually a bit on the edge of what's happening, and that again came out in the encounters I had with people. So there was a while at the peak of the crisis where I sort of got very stressed as a journalist and thought, oh, I should really be at, the bit where all the news cameras are, finding like the experience that sums this up. And I thought, I realised, I'm not going to be able to do that anyway, because sort of millions of other journalists are. But also, well, what's happening to the people that I already know at that point? And there's a bit, the way that I try and narrate the moment that the really large numbers of people started to move through the Balkans from Greece through southeastern Europe to get to Germany in the summer of 2015. That point where there were those quite striking footage of sort of Syrians and Afghans and Iraqis at the train station in Budapest, all trying to get onto trains and go to Austria and Germany. I was in Sicily at the house of a young man called Caesar, who's originally from Mali, and we were watching it on France 24. He was watching the story. He was part of the refugee crisis of 2015, but we were sitting there watching it on TV. And he, midway through this, turned around to me and said, "You see, it's only black people arriving in Sicily now, so the cameras have all gone over there." And I got this completely different take from him on it about how he could very acutely perceive there was a quite clearly racialized hierarchy of attention, in the way that the media was covering it. So. I just think telling it in that detail just allows you to start sort of exploring those kind of aspects as well.
One of the things that struck me as well while reading the book was the importance of language and the importance of the terms that are employed. I guess particularly by journalists, because there's a certain responsibility there, but also for the rest of us. Like when I was writing the introduction, when I was thinking about the questions. I think certain words which maybe I had broadly used interchangeably, refugee, asylum seeker, migrant slightly more broadly, I realised that the extent to which they were weighted and the extent to which they were employed particularly by politicians and by certain journalists, to cast a certain spin on the story. And one thing we notice while reading your book is this is something that the migrants you meet are very tuned into as well, about what is the difference between an economic migrant and a refugee. Yeah,
and I mean, obviously, we can probably all think of ways that language has been used to evoke hostility or to sort of cast aspersions on people, but it works the other way around as well. So there was a moment in 2015 at the peak of the crisis where Al Jazeera announced that they were going to start referring to the people crossing the Mediterranean as refugees, not migrants. And that was done explicitly, as they argued in a blog post on their website, because they want people to see this as an emergency, people needing protection and safety, people who are deserving of sympathy, essentially. But I mean, some of the people crossing the Mediterranean from Libya would not have met the definitions of refugees under international law. So then, kind of gives you the question: well, what about them? What if they are migrants? What if they are economic migrants, as that term is usually used? Is that a bad thing? I mean, are their experiences any less meaningful? If somebody went to Libya looking for work, as one or two people in my book have done, but ended up getting enslaved and tortured, as has happened to many people who fled conflicts and arrived in Libya, it's no less an experience, it's no less traumatic for them. And so just that's an example of sort of the trickiness of the language. I think perhaps the problem is that because it's tied up in these kind of complex laws and fought over at the political level, people think that they have to only use it in a certain way. I think it's there to be fought over, and actually talking about it and using words in a colloquial sense and using them to expand our definitions of who we can build solidarity with is really important. To take the word refugee as an example, yes, it's got a very specific legal meaning that is defined in things like the UN Refugee Convention, for example, but it's got a colloquial meaning that is much broader than that. And there were deliberate political decisions taken to define things in particularly narrow ways at particular times. So the UN Convention on the Status of Refugees does not include people who are displaced by natural disasters or climate change, for example. In fact, the original wording from 1951 doesn't even include people fleeing a war zone. It only includes people who are being persecuted as individuals. But it's actually, us using the language in the way that is right for us is what helps broaden those things and push for change, I think.
And I guess that sort of acts as or could act as sort of a resistance against the sort of the political attempts to narrow the definitions. I was just looking on my notes, I can't quite track it down now, but there's a moment where you talk about the certain people are not being defined anymore as refugees, but as... I can't remember exactly what it was now, but it was something which allowed governments to not give them the full protection of refugee status.
Yeah, I mean, the way it works in most European countries now, and a lot of other countries in the developed world, is that you have sort of gradations of protection. So there's kind of full political refugee status, which is to all intents and purposes permanent. You get some kind of sort of indefinite permission to stay in a country, and it puts you on the path to citizenship. But then there are things that are in Britain, for example, called humanitarian protection, which was a kind of protection introduced. It was really the use of that was really expanded after the wars in the Balkans in the 90s, where it was based on the idea, well, there's lots of people fleeing a war zone in general because it's a dangerous place to be right now, but when the war stops they can go home, and we don't want to kind of tie ourselves to having to accommodate them in our countries forever. So let's create this weaker form of protection. But I mean, in another sense, all those people are refugees. Yeah.
That was this term I was looking at. Humanitarian protection versus full refugee status. And on the flip side as well, it's interesting you talked about the sort of commonality of certain aspects of the experience of the people that you write about. And one thing that comes up several times is the fact that they're treated as animals. Or several times they say, well, we get treated like animals, and another time get treated like children.
Yeah.
And I thought, I think the sort of the treatment, being treated like animals, is something which I'd come across a description before. But the idea of this kind of infantilizing of refugees by the sort of the systems and the sort of bureaucratic bottlenecks that they're forced into was something that was quite new to me.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to think. Good way to describe this. I mean, one of the reasons why we have an international system of refugee protection is because, and one that was set up, the sort of framework for which was set up shortly after the Second World War, was because in between the World Wars there were large numbers of displaced people in Europe, and states never really resolved the question of what to do about that. So if you think over the course of the 20th century, the idea of universal human rights has come to be regarded as a good thing. There are international agreements and bodies and frameworks and the rest of it intended to ensure those rights, but your access to rights is in most cases guaranteed only by your membership of a nation state. So you have to be a citizen of somewhere to access rights that at the same time should be universal. And when people are forcibly displaced, if you have to flee your country and you can't go back, you effectively lose your citizenship, whether that's because your country has revoked it, or basically because it's meaningless once you've fled and can't go home. And the idea of a system of protection is to ensure a way that people can access their rights after they've been displaced. The thing is that because states also want to retain the right to say who can and can't come into their territory, to control immigration, control borders, you need to create this kind of sort of zone of exception for people that are claiming asylum, because you say we want to keep everybody out except the people that come and claim asylum, and then we have to have a process by which we decide whether their claims are genuine or not. And now that on paper sounds quite clean and quick and clinical. In reality, that's the story of this book. It's a sort of grey zone where your rights are unclear, yet at the same time you're absolutely subject to whatever the state you're in tells you. You know, you're completely under their power in a way that if you were a citizen, you'd have a bit of a defence against it. Your life is on hold. You're in many cases banned from working. You don't know where you're going to go next, and that actually, because of underfunded asylum systems, because of political conflict, can last years. In Greece, even before the refugee crisis, it was taking the Greek authorities up to 10 years just to make a decision on someone's asylum claim. There are people that I met in Sicily in 2014 who are still waiting for decisions on their asylum claims. So that kind of, that limbo is what people spend large parts of their lives in. And I think that on the one hand, yes, that leads to people feeling like they're being treated like animals, caged up, warehoused, the rest of it. But it also breeds this sense of infantilization because they're unable, they're being deliberately stopped from taking control of their own lives. And I know that there's probably one bit in particular you're thinking of there, that Caesar, the young man from Mali, He's an intelligent, well-read man. He ran his own electrician shop in northern Mali. His wife and kid, and he was in this asylum reception centre in Sicily, being made to colour in posters saying no to racism and things like that. And that's from people that want to do something good. But it's even with the best of intentions, if people are being restricted from just living. It really puts a distance between them and everyone around them. And
the concept of pocket money as well, which they're...
Yeah, so in Italy, the asylum support allowance is known as pocket money. They get €2 a day or something like that. And the people that run the reception centres will arbitrarily withhold that. So, you need to save this for clothes, so I'm going to hang on to that and I'll give it to you at the end of the month. So... Yeah.
There is a kind of contradiction, isn't there, when we think from a European perspective, which obviously there are sort of migration crises all over the world sort of happening in different ways, but this is a very obviously Europe-centred book. And one of the founding principles of the European Union was this kind of the freedom of movement, the kind of the collapse of borders. But you talk about how within the European Union, those borders more or less have come down, but there's been this kind of concurrent militarization of the borders on the where the European Union ends and the rest of the world begins. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the position of Europe in the book and the way that the migrants that you meet to sort of have to negotiate and navigate the systems within it.
Yeah, I mean, you're right to say it's primarily a book about Europe, and in many senses it is, but also it's a book about all of these other bits of the world that the people I met came from and how they relate to Europe. And I think it's that's crucial because it's different for each person about how they think about Europe, how they think about that place in it. But I think some common sort of ways of talking about it that I observed among people that I met in the course of my research is, one, this idea that yes, well, we're coming to Europe because Europe is this beacon of human rights, and we've been denied this elsewhere, and this surely is the place where we'll get it. Often followed by a very sharp sense of disillusionment that they've arrived and it's actually not that different to where they had been in some respects, or that they were not progressing in the way that they thought they had. But the other, I think, that came across very strongly is this sense that, because I would have to double check, I'm pretty sure every single person that I write about in the book, except for members of my own family, come from countries that within living memory were colonised by European powers. And they already have a relationship with Europe that I think is not reciprocated. So Jamal, who I read that little bit about, he, while in Greece, decided to try for the UK because the other Sudanese refugees he knew in Greece, who were a bit older and knew more about the world, said, well, you want to go to the UK because not only do they speak English there, but they were the former colonial power in Sudan, so they're going to know us and they're going to treat us better. I mean, I think to most British people, most British citizens, probably wouldn't even be aware that Britain once was the colonial power in Sudan, let alone thinking, the Sudanese, they're closely connected to us in a way they might think about Australians or Canadians or people from the US, for example. There's some obvious reasons why that might be. But also a kind of sense of not even the feeling that something is owed necessarily, but just well, we know all about you. How is it that you regard us as strangers? I had an encounter with a group of men in just south of Naples, who were all from French-speaking West Africa, saying, well, our grandfathers were tirailleurs sénégalais. We fought for France in the Second World War, and we come here and Europe treats us like we've got nothing to do with them. It was kind of just a sort of shock and outrage at it, I think.
Another thing that strikes me as sort of relatively contradictory is in the militarization of the European borders, it has given rise to this smuggling network, the extent of which kind of boggles the mind. Like when you you see the amount that the people that you met have paid over the course of their journey to get from one stage, from one country to the next, from one place to the other, and it seems, I don't know, it seems to me almost like this huge new sort of network of organized crime is being facilitated by the erection of these borders, which are clearly not particularly working.
Well, yeah, so that points to a kind of sort of, I guess, a kind of vicious circle when it comes to border control. I think scholars who study this have got a phrase that borders produce illegality, and what that means, crudely put, is that there's kind of politicians decide there's this problem, illegal immigration, so they put structures in place to stop it. That then blocks the journeys of people who feel that they have to carry on trying to make those journeys. And so instead of, crossing a land border or taking a train or a plane into a country, they have to find another way around that. And the tougher the border controls, the more that people will have to take dangerous routes or pay increasing amounts of money to smugglers who have various illegal ways of getting around those borders. All of that creates this spectacle, a greater spectacle of illegal immigration. I think the situation at Calais, perfect example of that. In the British press, Calais throughout the crisis was regarded as this sign that the borders weren't working. Well, the reason why there were so many people stuck in Calais and trying to hide underneath lorries and trying to storm the port is because Britain's borders were keeping them out for the large part. During the kind of peak of the refugee crisis, Britain's share of asylum applications in the EU went down. Britain had no refugee crisis yet, but because there was this increasing effort to crack down on borders in Calais, it looked like the problem was getting worse and worse.
I'm conscious there's going to be quite a few questions from the audience, so I will finish quite soon. So if you do have a question for Daniel, get it ready. We'll get a microphone to you. But what I would like to conclude our conversation on is just the role of a book like this. And this is something that you do reflect upon in it. I mean, there's one particular moment when I think it's Hakima is sort of saying, we keep having journalists visit and they ask us questions, they talk to us, and nothing changes. And so it's clear that sort of as a journalist, you're aware that this situation can arise and how frustrating it must be for the migrants. And yet, obviously, as a journalist as well, you've written this book, so you must see it as having some role in the world, some potential impact. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little about
Interesting.
that.
I mean, I sort of change my mind on this a lot. It depends on my mood. But I think the constant... I mean, the way that I wrote the book, the way I was able to write the book is to just tell myself, this isn't... and I think this is a good rule of thumb for journalists. Don't kid yourself that you're going to change anything with this. Just let people know how it was as you saw it, And especially as... I mean, the two subjects that I've written about the most over the last few years are refugees at Europe's borders and the far right in Britain and Europe. And it's quite something to be writing about a subject a lot and trying to tell people what's happening and just have it get worse over a period of several years. But I think, in a way, it's the point is to show what's happening. If nothing else, to tell people, well, you can't say you didn't know this was happening. I wonder, should I read just a little bit of that encounter that you mentioned? Just partly because I tried to think about this and articulately say what I thought the point of writing was. So let's see if I still agree with myself. So this, have I got enough for 4 pages, do you think? Yeah, okay. Because this will set the context as well. This is from a chapter about an Afghan family that I met in Athens in 2012. They were the first people that I met in the course of research for this book. My directions were to get out at Victoria Square metro station on the northwest edge of central Athens and walk. It was dark, mid-evening, after rush hour had died down when I left the station. Outside the Pakistani-run grocery stores that dotted the streets in this neighbourhood, men kept watch. The roads they surveyed were quiet, save for the occasional whine of a moped. The mood felt tense, which wasn't unusual for Athens at this time, the late autumn of 2012. It was the tail end of a year in which tens of thousands of Greeks had come out into the streets to protest the harsh austerity policies imposed by the EU after the financial crisis. In the city centre, riot police in protective gear lounged at street corners. There had been a large left-wing demonstration a few days earlier, and reinforcements were drafted in, tear gas at the ready. But there was a different source of unease in this neighbourhood. I crossed another square, dominated by a large Orthodox church dedicated to the 4th century martyr Saint Pantaleimon. The cafes around the square were open, but the square itself was largely deserted. On the ground in front of the church steps was a slogan spray-painted in blue and white, the same colours as the Greek flags which hung limply from surrounding apartment balconies. It translated as "Foreigners out, Greece for the Greeks." On a nearby street, angry scrawls of graffiti chased one another along a wall. Blue squiggles that looked like part of a meander design on ancient Greek pottery had been crossed out in black paint or supplanted by Circle A anarchy symbols. I arrived at an apartment doorway where a woman called Kanis was waiting to meet me. She was Afghan, as were the people I had arranged to meet, and she had agreed to translate for us. A man with a nervous demeanour answered the door, introduced himself as Saki, and motioned for us to take off our shoes. We walked through the front room where a sheet hung from the ceiling divided the kitchen area from the rest. 4 men lived here, Saki said. His family had the back room. We went through a door into their living area where mattresses had been cleared away to make a space where we could sit on cushions and a carpet. Saki's wife, a woman in her late 20s with a thin, serious face, was sitting there holding a baby. 2 other young children, a boy and a girl, both under 10, drew pictures on a piece of paper next to her. She said her name was Hakima. I tried to make conversation by asking about the baby. Was she born here, I asked, meaning in Greece. Yes, here, Hakima said, and pointed to the carpet. Hakima handed the baby to Saki. She went into another room and came back with a bowl of boiled sweets and cups of tea, and we began our interview. I was in Greece to report on the country's political crisis, and I had wanted to know how refugees were being affected. Hakima did most of the talking. They were virtually prisoners in their own home, she said. Saki had worked on a building site, but he had been beaten up by racists and lost his job while he was in hospital. Since then, the police had beaten him too, in front of his children. Without work, the family had had to rely on help from friends who still had jobs, and donations provided by a local church group. Did that affect their social life, I asked. How can we invite our friends round to socialise, Hakima said impatiently. We have no money, they have no money, they eat food from the garbage, they take things out of the garbage to sell them. She described how, with other Afghan women in the neighbourhood, she would look through rubbish bins to find useful items. They were so worried about being attacked, she said, that they only went out at night to do it in groups. We thought we would come here, we would be safe, we would be comfortable, Hakima said, shifting her baby from one arm to another. The people here don't treat us like human beings. She said there was little difference between the racists who attacked them, the police, and the rest of Greek society. They all hate us. It was difficult to find the common ground needed for a real conversation. The details of their story seemed so bleak, and Hakima was describing them so starkly that it didn't leave me much room to respond. After 20 minutes or so, Hakima lost her patience. She let out a stream of invective in Dari, which my translator relayed to me in English. We keep having journalists visit, and they want to hear our stories, but tell me, what can you do? Nothing changes. I mumbled something that I thought would sound encouraging about how other refugees had been here before them, that members of my own family had been refugees once and that they had got through it. But my words fell on stony ground. There didn't seem much more I could usefully do there, so once I'd got the details I needed for my story, I thanked the family politely and left. I've thought about this incident a lot since, as I've encountered more people in situations like Hakima's. I've also been asked the same sort of question, what can you do for us, by other people I've met. Often, journalists like to think that what they're doing is going to provoke a change. It's rarely the case, at least not in any direct way. the myth we believe is that exposing something we consider unjust is enough to fix it, but it's usually not. Most writers do not and will not get the chance to uncover a shocking new piece of information that makes a government or a society change its course. Instead, if there's anything useful in our work, it's more like fitting the pieces of a shattered mirror back together to explain how a person or a community has come to find itself at an impasse. As writers, we have the luxury of distance. We can step back from a situation, try to untangle the web of cause and effect that surrounds it, and retell it in a way that makes sense. That's what I want to do with Hakima's story here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's over to you now. If you have a question for Daniel, just raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you so everybody can hear you. We'll begin right at the front here.
This is actually more a comment about not about vocabulary, not Daniel's vocabulary, but the way in which the word migrant has entered both in English and in French, the way of talking about people who were previously described as either refugees or immigrants, or indeed exiles. And to me, the word migrant has a much less humanized and also less of less implication of a narrative behind it. An immigrant is someone who goes from one country to another in search of a better life or in search of work, or a refugee is someone who is escaping persecution. Whereas migrant seems both abstract and dehumanizing.
Shall we take another question, and then I'll respond to a couple?
Do we have,
if there are,
anyone would like to add?
I mean, I can just respond to that one if not.
Okay, there's a lady there. We'll just run the microphone to you. 1 second.
Hi. It's actually a bit hard to formulate exactly, but I'd like to hear what you have to say about. You mentioned the outside borders of the EU, but actually the borders inside the EU are starting to raise again, which is doesn't make sense with the theory of what Europe should be. So can you tell us about that?
Okay, I'll answer those two. On the point about the word migrant, yeah, I agree. I mean, I think before about 2014 or 15, at least in English, you didn't really see that word very much, except in technical documents. Some sort of migration policy or quite specific things. And then it suddenly was everywhere. And I think it absolutely is a word that sort of strips narrative away. And also, it's not. I mean, it's dehumanizing in that sense, I think, potentially. But also, the other area that you see it used a lot is in talking about animal migration, and I think that hangs over it when it's applied to humans. And I think the implications of that are quite clear. I mean, the thing is, it's a word that words acquire meaning through use and the way people use them, and I think there's a real battle over what kind of content to fill that one with. I thought there was a very good piece by the American Nigerian writer Teju Cole, I think in 2015. I think it was a response to what I mentioned earlier, that Al Jazeera deciding to switch to refugees, and he said no, what we should be trying to do is humanise the word migrant and defend that and expand our conception of that, and I'm inclined to agree with him on that debate, I think.
Could I just chip in just very quickly? I just found it a really fascinating comment, because just my kind of instinctive reaction to the word migrant is that it broadens out the meaning and therefore doesn't sort of pigeonhole people to one particular experience. So in the case of if you're a refugee and you're an economic migrant, I thought that the broad as a kind of catch-all term, it sort of allowed people to be less pigeonholed and less kind of defined.
Potentially. The problem is it's only applied to a very narrow category of migration at the moment. I mean, am I a migrant because I got the Eurostar over from, I'm an economic migrant to Paris today because I'm hoping that you'll all buy copies of my book and I can go home. But at the moment it's not used like that. And then in response to your question about, yes, I mean, absolutely, the story of sort of asylum in Europe is that the borders have always been there for those people, because internal borders within the EU, because again, you had this kind of more complex external border building up as a trade-off for internal free movement of EU citizens, what you also have had is this common agreement on asylum in Europe called the Dublin system, which main stipulation is that it's the EU country an asylum seeker first sets foot in that has to process their asylum claim, and people who move on to another country should be sent back. So that's why, for example, people were burning off their fingerprints in Calais. So that's always been the case. It was part of the crisis of 2015 was those internal borders for refugees collapsing and people relocating themselves, essentially. Now it's back with a vengeance, and you also have something that wasn't so apparent before the crisis, which is a kind of racialised border control at the internal borders of the EU. So if any of you have been down to the border near Ventimiglia, the French-Italian border, which I was at last summer to write a piece from, I mean, a mix of France's state of emergency, allowing it to flood that area with police who are supposedly doing anti-terror work, and a loophole, a kind of allowance in the Schengen Agreement for limited kind of border controls, as long as they're not applied to everybody. Every single road in all of the villages around that border, all of the trains, they've all got French police on, and they're not allowed by law to check everybody, so they racially profile people. And you can, I mean, it's just the most blatant. And I mean, even compared to sort of Britain's use of police stop and search, I would say that is the most blatant use of racial profiling in Europe at the moment. It's going on in France. And then, I mean, there's kind of a bigger question about free movement of EU citizens and who that was for anyway, and the fact that, you know, although it gives all of us rights, which at the moment my government is trying to take away from me, it also has been a system for allowing richer countries to benefit from the cheap labour of countries that the overall economic system is keeping poor, and to drain, you know, intelligence and resources and people away from Bulgaria and Romania, for example, you know, which, regardless of the fact that I think that movement should be a right, the way that it's being done without a sort of accompanying programme to distribute resources fairly is an absolute tragedy for those countries. And I mean, there's been Romanian journalists and Bulgarian journalists in the UK who've written well about that side of it.
Just on the Dublin Agreement, doesn't that seem, just from a sort of geographical point of view, doesn't that seem completely imbalanced? I mean, it's ironic perhaps that it should be agreed in Dublin, which is kind of, because of its geographical location, is least likely to receive any refugees. It just seems odd that should be a thing that would have been agreed to in the first place.
I mean, like a lot of other things in the EU, it was shaped largely by the rich northwestern European countries who, at the time this was agreed, around the turn of the century, would have argued that, well, actually, we get the most asylum applications, you know, proportionally and just in sort of raw numbers, and that's because a lot of people fly into our countries and claim asylum. So in Britain, for example, refugees from the Democratic Republic of Congo will almost all arrive in Britain by plane. But Europe's policy over the last decade and a bit has been to close off those kind of routes. So there's an EU directive that fines aircraft carriers and other transport carriers if people arrive without the correct documents. So that's really cracked down on, you know, that was a question you saw in 2015. Why can't Syrians just get on ferries or board planes? This is why, basically. And then it also doesn't make any sense if you have large numbers of people crossing into the EU by land or by sea, because geographically it's southern and eastern Europe where they're going to first set foot, which are poorer countries generally, and the asylum systems tend to be less well equipped to deal with people. And that essentially, so the way I've written about this in the past is to say that what was happening in 2015 and 16 was not just a refugee crisis in the sense of something bad happening over there, people that are nothing to do with us suddenly arriving on our doors, but it was a European border crisis. This was, you know, the chaos and the death that we saw was the result of decisions taken by European governments and things done within Europe.
Any more questions for Daniel? Yeah, we'll just get the microphone to you because there's people all around the bookstore.
Thank you. It's been very interesting. Well, I just I'm come from Australia, where there are the idea has kind of been developed by successive governments that refugees are the same as illegals. I mean, the idea now in Australia that has been not right and left really have gone along with the idea really that it's illegal to be a refugee, and I'm wondering, is that the same here?
Well, just quickly, I mean, it wasn't, but it's increasingly becoming so. Obviously, in the US is where it's, you know, Trump has been. That's exactly the kind of paradigm he's trying to enforce at the moment. I mean, in a way, in Australia as well as in Europe, the root of this is the kind of that question about, well, they fled their country, but they were already somewhere safe, so why are they coming here? And that, I think, is predicated on a misconception that most refugees are trying to get to the rich white parts of the world. That's not true. 86% of the world's refugees are hosted in developing countries. That proportion has risen in the last decade. So actually what the West, so-called West, has been doing is actually successfully keeping a lot of people out. And at the same time, it's been, you know, the world as a whole, rich governments particularly, have been seriously underfunding relief programs, resettlement schemes. Now Donald Trump again is actively attacking resettlement, and that's why people carry on moving. So and until that root cause is addressed, you're going to, you know, governments are going to try and take that kind of path that Australia has pioneered in a way, I think. Well, Australia and Israel, I would say, they also were leaders in this.
Okay, we'll just finish with this gentleman just there.
Thank you. Hi. My question is about organisations or charities that you came across which were doing really good work, which you're actually impressed with, whether it be a country as well or something like that. Thanks.
I'll start with countries because that's the more tricky one, and it's good to think about what. So I've said a few things that make it, you know, that are critical of Italy's asylum system, for instance, but the one thing that I will say for it is they rarely lock people up. And I think Italy's commitment, I mean, again, now that's at risk because of the change in government, but the commitment to having a kind of open system, you know, they also have this thing that if you're waiting for more than 6 months on an asylum claim, you get a limited right to work. That's better than the UK, for example. I mean, the problem is in somewhere like Sicily, there's not really the work. So it's tricky, but there are for some people. I mean, you know, so countries that kind of retain that openness, especially under severe pressure. I think Italy has done until now, at least within the country. Sweden as well, obviously. You know, governments that have at least responded to public pressure and have increased kinds of resettlement. So, you know, Britain wasn't going to resettle any Syrians until David Cameron came under a lot of pressure. Sort of, there are little efforts like that are good. In terms of charities and organisations, kind of at the top level, I think Médecins Sans Frontières have really, I really like what they, if you're going to have kind of big organisations essentially doing the jobs that government should, that's a good way to do it, because it's really focused on like immediate needs, and they're political about it. They intervene in a way that says we're also doing this to shame people into responding, but I wouldn't. I think what's equally important is kind of grassroots work that is rooted in people responding to what's on their doorstep. And the reason I say that is because I think it goes back to these questions about kind of language and how people relate to one another. The reason I was in the border area between France and Italy was because I was asked by a British magazine to do a profile of this farmer Cédric Herou, who probably a lot of you know because he's become a kind of folk hero in France, or villain according to your political leanings, because he's been accommodating migrants on his farm, which is near the border, and you know, helping people continue their journeys, and he's now been prosecuted several times for that. But I thought his way of putting it was really struck me, which was, I don't help migrants, I help people on my doorstep because they're in need. And I think that all of the good kinds of action around this are rooted in that understanding, whether they're, you know, some of them are just providing people with basic immediate things like food and shelter and clothing, but also I think, I know in Britain, for example, like sort of strategic litigation, legal challenges to what the government is doing has been really important. So the British government was refusing to take in any unaccompanied refugee children who were stuck in Calais. There was a political campaign that made the government agree to take in an unspecified number via one scheme, but at the same time there was this court case that was brought just to force the government to apply its own laws, and under that scheme you've had around 2,000 children come in. But you know, that's those things are formulated by people I think are starting from that same starting point as Cedric and other people.
I think that is a really good note to finish on, actually, and that is all we've got time for. At least, as I always say, for the formal conversational part of the evening, we will be serving wine, so do stick around, continue the conversation with each other, with Daniel. We have plenty of copies of Lights in the Distance available at the till. I really can't recommend it highly enough. It's a very moving, I think a very important work. We haven't had the time really to do justice to the many individual stories we find in the book, each unique, each fascinating. Really a really important read, so do pick up your copy there. Daniel will be here signing those for you, so all that remains for me to say is please join me one more time in thanking Daniel Trilling.
Thank you.